Hey everyone. So today we're going to talk about the Israeli electoral system, how it works. There's an election coming up. October 27th is the date that was set for it. And every time there's an election in Israel, I get similar questions from my American friends. They want to know why we have, 24 different parties running, and they want to know what schedule elections are on. Why do they seem to happen every couple of years? And they want to know who's running for prime minister, which is kind of an inexact question when it comes to Israeli politics. I'm going to explain all of that in this video, how the government is formed, how the electoral politics work. What I'm not going to do in this video is talk about the mechanics of our election in terms of what actually happens in a polling booth, how a person actually votes, how votes are counted. I've been in the counting room. I've been a poll observer, a poll watcher, a poll worker in a number of elections. So I know that process intimately, but that's not what I'm going to be dealing with in this video. This video is going to be more of an overview of the Israeli electoral system. Now, this election is actually quite significant because on October 27th, when we go to elections, this will be the first time since 1988, that's right, 1988, almost 40 years since we had an election because a Knesset already actually went to its full term. Every other election since 1988 has been the result of the government falling or being dissolved ahead of time. We're going to find out what that means in this video. So stay with me. Okay. Now things have changed over the years, over the decades in the laws that govern Israeli electoral politics. So, for example, there was a period of Israeli history where you could have a party with only one seat in Knesset. That's impossible today. We'll find out about that soon in a few minutes. There was also a long stretch of Israel's history where there was one dominant party that basically ran the country for like the first 30 years of Israel's history. And we're going to understand all of that. Here we go. First of all, the basics. The Knesset is Israel's parliament. It's its legislature. And it's 120 members, and it's only one chamber. It doesn't have two houses like America's House and Senate. It's just one body, the 120 members of the Knesset. And Israel has a parliamentary system, not a presidential one. And that means that it's different than what Americans are used to. Many other countries have parliamentary systems. So let me spell out what it means. In America, you vote separately for your president and for your Congress. In Israel, you do not. There is no separate ballot for prime minister. You don't vote for a prime minister. When I said in my intro to this that the question who's running for prime minister is a bit of an inexact question in Israel, or a vague question, it's because you don't actually vote for a prime minister. You cast one vote, and the vote that you cast is for a party. Period. That's it. That's the entire election. Like what you're used to if you're from the United States, where you go in and there's a whole bunch of different things that you're voting on. You're voting for congressmen, you're voting for senators, you're voting for, there's different positions you're voting for. You're voting for the Secretary of State of your state, whatever it is. That's not what you're voting for in Israel. In Israel, you cast one vote and it's for a party. And the party's strength in the Knesset will determine who gets to try to become prime minister. The government, which is the prime minister and the cabinet, is assembled out of the Knesset itself. And the Knesset can remove that government with a vote of no confidence. So if at any point while a government is in power, if 61 Knesset members vote a vote of no confidence, they bring down the government and we go to new elections. Now, there is a president of Israel. That is a role, but it's a ceremonial figure. It's not voted on by the public. It's really just a ceremonial. It's a ceremonial figure, kind of similar to royal family members in in the UK. A little bit more than that. He has a few duties, but it's basically a ceremonial figure, largely symbolic. The real power, the real political power, sits with the prime minister and the Knesset. Okay. Now here, let's get into how you actually vote. Here's where it's different from almost anywhere else in the democratic world. Israel is one single national voting district. Okay, we don't, like in Canada, you have, ridings, which is like congressional districts. And what you're voting for in the parliament is you're voting in your district for who's going to represent your district, right? You have that in many, many countries. Israel does not have that. The whole country is one district, as it were. It's one constituency, and you're not voting for a person. You're voting, as I said before, for a party list. It's a closed list. That means that the party decides when they register their party, not when they register the party, but when there's a date prior to the elections. It's usually about a month and a half before the elections. There's a date prior to the elections where they have to submit their list. And their list is an order of its own people who, listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a list. And that they submit that list, and you just vote for a party. You vote for a party list. As a voter, you have zero ability to move someone up or down the party list. Okay, that could happen in parties that have primaries. Some parties have primaries, some don't in Israel. That's up to the party itself. How a party determines who's on its list can involve a primary system where a voter who's a member of that party, who's eligible to vote in the primaries, can move someone up or down the list. But on election day, you have no impact on that. You're just voting for a party. Okay, so you're either voting for Likud or Labor or whatever, Yesh Atid, whatever party you're voting for, and you're voting for a list. And now, often on the slip of paper that you're using to vote, meaning because you have these slips of paper and you take one and you put it in an envelope and you vote. We'll get into that in a different video. Sometimes the leader of the party's name might be listed there also, but you're not voting for a person. Every vote. So here's what happens. Everyone votes, one vote. All they're doing is voting for a party. It all then gets tallied up into one tally of all the votes nationally. Remember, it's all one big district. And then the 120 Knesset seats are divided up proportionally to the parties based on how many votes they got. So hypothetically, let's say a party gets 10% of the national vote, then it would get 10% of the 120 seats in Knesset. It would get about 12 seats. Okay, that's in theory, but here's how it really works. There's a threshold to get in. A party has to clear the threshold of 3.25%, 3.25% of the total vote, of the vote total of the entire nation. You take all the votes that were cast, and a party has to have at least 3.25% of the total votes cast in order to get in. That's what's called the threshold. If you cross the threshold, you're in the Knesset, and you then get 4 seats. That's the minimum number you get. Okay, 3.25% of 120 seats, you get 4 seats if you get in. If you get below 3.25%, you don't get anything. You don't get a fraction of a seat. And that threshold number, that 3.25%, is the single most important number in Israeli politics. I'm going to come back to it because it hasn't always been 3.25%. It used to be a lot lower, and that changed everything about what the Knesset looked like. Now, here's a detail that a lot of people, almost no one outside of Israel, does not know. If a party does not clear the threshold, its votes don't get redistributed to anyone. They're simply gone. They're thrown out. They're removed, which means that the first thing that happens after the election is we check to see which parties reach 3.25%. Those parties are in with a minimum of 4 seats. All the parties that didn't reach the threshold, all of those votes get essentially thrown in the trash. They're gone. And then the remaining, all the votes from parties that made it in then get divided by 120. Okay? So a party that gets 3% of the national vote and misses the 3.25, they missed that extra 0.25%, they get 0 seats. All of those votes just vanish from the calculation. But once a party does get in, okay, once a party does get in, they'll get however many votes they get, and then they're going to get their seats in the Knesset. But no party's vote total is going to divide evenly into whole seats. Right? You're not going to have where there's 120 seats and there's an exact number that divides perfectly into 120. There's always going to be leftover fractions. Once we determine how many votes is a seat, there's going to be leftover fractions of seats. There's going to be extra votes that parties have beyond what was needed for the seats that they won. So what happens here, listen carefully, before the election takes place, parties that are running are allowed to sign a vote sharing agreement. Okay. And it's named after it's called the Bader Ofer method. It's named after the two lawmakers, one from Likud and one from Labor, way back in the 1970s, who wrote this law. And this vote sharing agreement, under these agreements, when it comes time to divvy up the leftover fractions of seats, two parties that signed an agreement with each other get to pool those votes, and whichever of the two parties had more surplus votes, which means, in other words, whichever of the two parties was closer to having the next seat, gets the votes of the other party that it signed an agreement with, which can sometimes tip the balance and bring another seat to that party. Now, why would they do that? Well, why would a party that, of course, every party hopes that it's going to be the winner and get the extra seat, but parties do that so that votes don't go to waste, because they sign these agreements with parties who they are ideologically close to, parties that, or in terms of policy, they're close to, parties that they would want to be in a coalition with. And this helps the bloc, whether it's the right-wing bloc or the left-wing bloc, it helps them, conserve votes and not have votes go to waste. And that could make a big difference. It could sometimes tip the scale about whether or not there's a majority, there's a coalition. So you'll see this right before an election. Let's say two right-wing parties or two religious parties or two parties on the left will announce a vote-sharing agreement with each other. And again, they're always ideologically aligned, because you're trusting your leftover votes to boost a party that you'd actually be comfortable sitting in a coalition with. Now, only a small handful of developed democracies do things this way, meaning one national district, a closed list, no personal, you're not voting for any person, you're not voting in a district or a region. The Netherlands does something similar. Spain and Portugal use closed lists also, but they have regional districts. So Israel is actually the only developed democracy that has neither a personal component, where you're voting for particular people, nor a regional breakup, where it's all just one. That's only Israel. Now, this explains a lot about what frustrates outside observers about Israeli politics. And sometimes it frustrates Israelis, because you live in Israel, you don't have a local congressman or a local representative. There isn't a member of Knesset that represents you by district. It's almost like a theoretical representation, like you voted for someone who's ideologically aligned or you like their policies, and then they get a bunch of seats, but there's no way for you to verify with them that they represent you. It's not like when you live in a congressional district, you call your congressman and you say, I live in your district, I'm one of your voters. You don't have that relationship with lawmakers in Israel, because it's proportional. Okay. All the votes are just in one enormous national bucket. Now, because no party in history has ever won 61 seats, which is a majority of the Knesset, and that's the majority you need to create a coalition to set up a government. Every single government has been a coalition. Okay, so far, what have we done thus far? We've taken all the votes. We've eliminated the parties that didn't cross the threshold. We've taken the remaining votes. We've divided them by 120, more or less. And then there's the extra votes go to different parties, and we figure out who has how many seats. Okay, and then we have all these different parties, and they have a whole bunch, and they all have different seats. And now we have to put together a coalition of minimum 61 majority that is going to become the government. Okay, so because no party in Israel's history has ever won 61 seats, every single Israeli government in history has been a coalition government. So after the election, the president, this ceremonial position, this is where he actually plays a role. He's similar in his duties to like the vice president of the United States, where he can do diplomacy and does sometimes get involved in things, but doesn't really have any authority over anything. So after the election, the president meets with every party that got in, and he asks essentially three questions. Who do you want to have as prime minister? Who will you sit in a coalition with? Who are you willing to sit in a coalition with? Like, for example, right-wing parties, religious parties, most parties in Israel won't sit in a coalition with the Arab parties that are openly anti-Israel, that are in the Knesset, right? They won't sit with them, for example. Or there's numerous secular parties. There's always secular parties that don't want to sit with the religious parties, right? Things like that. So the president will ask, who do you recommend for prime minister? Who will you sit in a coalition with? And who will you absolutely not sit with? And based on the answers that he gets, he determines who is most likely to be able to form a government. And he hands the mandate, the job of trying to form a government, of getting a 61 majority, he hands it to one Knesset member. And usually, almost always, that person that he hands it to is the person who's number one on the list of the largest party that made it into Knesset. Now, it's not always the case. Naftali Bennett became prime minister in 2021, leading a party that had only 7 seats, because he was the person who could stitch together 61 votes to form a government. Didn't last very long, that government, but that's an example. You don't have to be the head of the biggest party. Now, was Naftali Bennett running for prime minister in that election? No. He ran a very small party. They only got 7 seats. And that's why I say that, like, this question, are you running for prime minister? So Prime Minister Netanyahu is running for prime minister only by virtue of the fact that he's the head of what is probably going to be the largest party, one of the 2 largest parties. It will probably be the largest party. So that's what it means to be running for prime minister. Now, the MK who was chosen by the president to form a government then has a limited window. It's a few weeks or a month. He has a limited window of time to negotiate coalition agreements. And that means he's talking to the heads of the other parties about who gets which ministry, what policies the government will pursue. And then he presents a government. Once he's got the 61, he's got the majority who are all signed on to be part of the coalition. They then convene the Knesset and they have a confidence vote. If a plurality of that vote, if he wins with the plurality of that vote, the government wins. So the government starts functioning. The government is seated. Those ministers take their roles. This is now the government. This is the cabinet, and we have a government. Okay. If every attempt fails, if they can't pass it, if they can't get 61, then the Knesset dissolves and you go back to elections. You might remember a few years ago, we had a whole bunch of elections in quick succession because they couldn't form a government. We were having elections, we could not form a government. This is part of why Israeli elections happen so often, because, even once you have the government up and running, there could be a faction within it, a few Knesset members, or one party within it that suddenly doesn't like something the government does, or is disgruntled for whatever reason, and decides that they're leaving the coalition. They call a vote of no confidence. 61 vote against the government. They vote no confidence, and then the government falls, and you have to go to new elections. Since 1996, so in the last 30 years, Israel's gone to the polls on an average of every 2.4 years, more frequently than any other parliamentary democracy on earth. Now, the last time an Israeli election happened on the 4-year schedule, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, did I mention it? Was 1988, right? It's the last time government actually went the full 4 years. Every election other than that, every election since then, since 1988, has been early for one reason or another. Maybe the budget didn't pass, maybe the coalition collapsed for some other reason, or the prime minister resigned. We had that. Now, here's where I want to take you back, because the Knesset you see today with roughly a dozen parties is actually more stable and more consolidated than it used to be. And that's not an accident. It's the direct result of deliberate policy decisions. For decades, Israel's electoral threshold was not 3.25%. It was 1%. 1%. And that meant you could get 1 seat, right? If you have a 1% threshold, combine that with a single national bucket of all the votes where anyone can register a party, and it produces what you'd expect, which is a huge number of tiny factions, tiny parties running, because the threshold is so low. If people think that they can get 1% of the vote, they can get into Knesset. And sometimes there would be parties that were built around no ideology at all. There's one crazy example that I always give people from the 1970s. There was a guy named Shmuel Flato Sharon. And in 1977, this is a real story, he was a French He was a French-Israeli businessman, and he was facing embezzlement charges in France for allegedly defrauding investors out of tens of millions of dollars. And he formed his own political party, ran a campaign in which he promised that if elected, he would provide apartments to young voters, which is, of course, nonsense. And enough people believed him, and he won enough of the vote to take a single Knesset seat. And then he used the fact that he had a Knesset seat to avoid extradition to France, because there's a legal immunity from extradition that Knesset members have. And that's why he ran. And he got in. It's crazy. I know this is not an exaggeration. It's not a footnote. It's a real story. And it was legal because the barrier to enter the Knesset was 1% of the vote. Okay. Now that system stayed in place through 1988. Then starting in 1992, Israel raised the threshold to 1.5%. And then it went up again in 2003 to 2%. And finally, in 2014, it was raised to where it is today, 3.25%. Each of those increases was a conscious attempt by the Knesset to solve the same problem. Too many small parties made governing coalitions unstable. Now, of course, the parties in power have an incentive to lock smaller parties out unless they themselves are very small. But this passed in the Knesset. Now, when you have all these teeny tiny parties of one seat, every little one Knesset member has to be somehow incentivized to join the coalition. And that means he has to be given things, ministries, whatever. It made it too easy for a handful of votes to hold the entire government hostage. Raising the threshold was Israel's way of trading some representativeness for some stability, because by raising the threshold, it means that there are, like, let's say you have a party that's running and they could get 2% of the vote. That's still a lot of seats. You can get a couple seats in Knesset, and you're not going to cross the threshold. You won't be represented. So they gave up on some of the representativeness of the system for some stability. It didn't fully solve the fragmentation problem. Israel still has one of the most fragmented parliaments in the world, in the developed world, alongside places like the Netherlands and Belgium. But it did shut the door on like a scheme like this guy Flato Sharon ran in the 1970s to get out of being extradited to France. Crazy story. Anyway, here's the other historical piece that people don't know. It's actually the flip side of the fragmentation story. For the first 30 years of Israel's existence, from 1948 till 1977, one party dominated Israeli politics almost completely. It was called Mapai. It was David Ben-Gurion's party. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. It was his party. And it later folded into what became the Labor Party. It got a new name. It became called the Ma'arach, the alignment. But it wasn't just that they won elections. Mapai, which was this Labor Party, this left-wing sort of socialist party, Mapai and its successors didn't just control the government. They had a hand in nearly every major institution in this young state. The Histadrut, which is the National Labor Federation, which at the time ran huge parts of the economy, healthcare and employment. There was also the Jewish Agency, which controlled immigration and absorption. This was all controlled by Mapai. Large parts of the military and the civil service were controlled by them. So if you were a new immigrant arriving in Israel in the 1950s, your housing, your job, and very often your healthcare, your banking ran through institutions that Mapai effectively controlled. Political scientists call this a dominant party system, right? Well, meaning elections happen, they're still free and fair, you're still voting, but one party's grip on the machinery of the state made it almost unthinkable that anyone else could actually take power. And then in 1977, this system broke. Menachem Begin, as the head of the Likud, won the election. And Israelis call what happened that year the Mahapach, which literally means like the upheaval or the revolution, the overturning. It was the first transfer of power to a different party since the state was founded in 1948. Begin's win, it reflected very, very real, very deep changes in Israeli society. There were waves of immigrants from Middle Eastern and North African countries who felt shut out by the old Ashkenazi European labor establishment. There was a growing dissatisfaction with this socialist state-controlled economy. There was also the aftermath of the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, which was 4 years earlier. Whatever the exact mix of causes, the effect was unmistakable. After 3 decades of one-party dominance, that was over in a single election, and Israeli politics has been genuinely competitive between multiple blocs ever since. Although the last couple of decades, we've now seen something similar where the right wing, the Likud and the right-wing parties have been quite dominant, not to the extent that Labor was. We're never going to go back to that because, like I said, they controlled a lot of the apparatuses of the state. Anyway, you put all this together and you can understand modern Israeli politics a lot better. There were 30 years where one party's dominance was so complete that elections were almost a formality. You just knew that Mapai was going to be in power. And then you had a system with such a low threshold to get in that literally anyone could start a party and get into the Knesset, which fragmented Israeli politics into dozens of tiny factions. And the system Israel has today, this 3.25% threshold, the coalition government with fairly frequent elections, is really the attempt to find a middle ground between those two extremes. It's representative enough that there's real ideological diversity that gets a voice in the Knesset, but it also has a high enough bar that you don't get a legislature of a whole bunch of one-man parties who are holding the whole government hostage. It's not a perfect system, far from it. Israel still holds elections more often than almost anywhere else in the world. Small parties still frequently end up as kingmakers with outsized leverage over the government. But now, when you watch this next election unfold on October 27th, and you see a dozen plus parties on the ballot, and then there's this lag time. And Americans always say, "Who won?" It's not so simple. You have to let the dust settle. How many seats did everyone get? And then begins the negotiation to form a coalition. When you see all this happen, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on and understand that it's not just chaos. I mean, there's a lot of chaos, but it's not just chaos. It's the result of 70 plus years of this small, remarkable country trying to work out how to govern itself. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and we're going to do more videos like this. Like I said, I'm going to do another video that's more about the technicalities of the voting process and the counting process, how votes are counted, how integrity of the election is ensured. We'll do that separately. But I hope you found this helpful. We'll be doing more. This is all gearing up for the election campaign. I'm also going to start covering all of the different parties that are running in the elections as well. We're going to cover that as well. Oh, one last thing. Make sure that you are signed up for the webinar that's coming on Wednesday. Mamdani's New York City, A Warning to America. We have former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, one of the great Americans, a great historic figure. We have Shabbos Kestenbaum, one of the young, bright public intellectuals and communicators. He works for PragerU, and he'll be speaking as well. Robert Spencer, the great author, has written many books about Islam, wrote a book about Mamdani. And Rabbi Daniel Schambach, who's been at the forefront of the demonstrations and the political activity countering all the damaging effects of the Mamdani regime in New York. He's been a very important voice. He's going to be joining us as well next Sunday, August 16th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. in Israel. Make sure you're signed up. The link is in the description of this video, or go to israel365.com/Mamdani, or click the QR code that is on your screen. You don't want to miss this webinar. If you can't make the time, don't worry about it. If you are registered, you will receive a full, you'll receive a link to the full webinar in your inbox. All right, God bless. Thanks for watching.